Hello, History of Sexuality grad students. This is Professor Bowen. Welcome to this, our final seminar of the semester. This week in class, we're going to be reading and talking about an exciting historical monograph called Sexual Liberation, Socialist Style, Communist Czechoslovakia and the Science of Desire, 1945 to 1989. The book was published in 2018 by Cambridge University Press, and its author is Kateřina Lišková, who is currently an associate professor of sociology and gender studies at Masaryk University in Brno, which is a city in the Czech Republic. In this video, I want to give you all an overview of Liškova's fascinating book and also set you up with some questions that you can discuss in your response papers. So, let's dive into the text. In one sense, this is a very conventional book. Its subject matter is sexology, something we've talked about at length during the semester, and which you know is one of the most thoroughly researched topics in the history of sexuality. In Sexual Liberation, Socialist Style, Lišková examines the development of sexology and its relationship with society and the state in Cold War Czechoslovakia. Following Foucault, Lišková assumes that experts and expert knowledge have played a key role in shaping our contemporary sexual identities, and as such, the focus throughout is on sexologists. Liškova's primary sources include sexological books and articles, letters, mostly individual correspondence with the media and different governmental departments, and official state records. And she uses these sources to write about some very traditional topics like population development, marriage and the family, infertility and reproduction, and sexual deviance. While this is a familiar approach to take, the story that Lišková tells here is far from familiar. In narrating the history of sexual liberation in communist Czechoslovakia, Lišková challenges a number of key assumptions about the history of sexuality. First, in focusing on sexology, she shows that this discipline developed not only in Central Europe, Great Britain, and the United States, but also in Eastern Europe, namely in Prague, where the Institute for the Study of Sexual Pathology was formed in 1921, just 2 years after Magnus Hirschfeld's institute was founded. Moreover, whereas the history of the Hirschfeld Institute ended in 1933, when the Nazis burned it down, the story of the Prague Institute continued throughout the 20th century. As Lišková observed, it was a public, university-based site of research that, quote, functioned without interruption throughout the whole communist period. One of its founders was Joseph Hinier, a venereologist and dermatologist who spent the 1940s and 50s gathering a group of similarly inclined medical professionals around him, and eventually who helped make sexology a medical specialty within the country. In 1970, sexologists established their own professional organization, and later in the decade, sexologists were appointed to various governmental advisory boards. In 1974, a sexological center at an outpatient clinic was established outside of Prague, and in that same year, lectures on sexology became a standard part of medical education. Reflecting on all of this, Lišková states that, quote, the regime and its proponents saw sexology as important, and its significance grew over time. Or, to put it another way, sexuality was central to the socialist project. This is an incredibly intriguing argument because it runs counter to the whole "there was no sex in the Soviet bloc" mantra. Instead of being ignored, it was thoroughly managed and regulated, and the ideas generated by sexologists had a noticeable impact on people's identities and their behaviors. In making this argument, Lišková challenges the commonplace view that the peoples of the Soviet Union and its Eastern Bloc satellites were puritanical, asexual beings who placed reproduction above pleasure. In Czechoslovakia, the author contends, sexologists forged and debated measures that shaped people's lives in their most intimate domains. This is also quite a bold claim because it runs counter to the widely accepted view that sexology, along with associated fields like psychology and psychiatry, only shaped people's identities and subjectivities in Western liberal societies. Thus, in bringing the history of Czech sexology to light, Lišková undermines the idea that psychology and psychiatry only impacted processes of identity formation in Western liberal societies. The so-called sciences, she observes, were not limited to the West, as the science of sexology was present and indispensable for the Czechoslovak regime to navigate the people's selves according to its own changing priorities. Third, and I think most importantly, Liškova's book challenges ingrained assumptions about progress in the history of sexuality. Whereas much scholarship is premised on what Dagmar Herzog calls the liberalization paradigm, that is, the gradual overcoming of obstacles to sexual freedom, Lišková shows that in the Czech Republic, things did not necessarily get better and better over time. In fact, in this story, what we see is that while the socialist countries of Eastern Europe experienced a good deal of sexual liberation in the decades immediately after World War II, all of this came to an end in 1968, when, after the failure of the Prague Spring, a Soviet-led invasion set the country on the path toward re-traditionalization. But before that, Lišková argues, the socialist countries of Eastern Europe experienced a lot of sexual liberation. Within Czechoslovakia, sexual emancipation came from above, from state policies and practices that granted women new levels of freedom, independence, and self-sufficiency, both inside and outside of marriage. In the 1950s and 60s, the country's ruling authorities advocated for gender equality and promulgated gender norms consistent with the ideals of companionate marriage. Far from being prude or repressive, the state legalized abortion in 1957, sponsored research on female orgasm and women's sexual satisfaction from 1952, and even decriminalized homosexuality in 1961. The 1970s and 80s, by contrast, were a step backward in terms of Czechoslovak approaches to gender and sexuality. Whereas equality between spouses had previously been the state's official goal, now, increasingly, it was patriarchy, a form of gender hierarchy that set men over women and demanded a rigid heterosexual order. The sexual radicalism of the immediate post-war period was ushered out, and in its place came a retreat to the private sphere, one based on strict gender divisions. The era of normalization, or re-traditionalization, lasted until the fall of the USSR in 1989. Despite this shift, however, there were some consistent trends from the period 1945 to 1989. One constant was the state's interest in regulating marriage and sexuality. As Lišková puts it, marriage and family were supposed to be the anchors of sexual life at any given point in communist times. And over time, this interest grew and grew. Czechoslovak sexual attitudes and practices did not move forward in a linear fashion, as sexuality is commonly thought to do, and neither did they reflect decrees or opinions emanating from Moscow. Generalizations about sexuality, the author cautions, cannot be made about all socialist countries in all historical eras. When it comes to sexuality, there was no single communist period, not even in one country. In terms of the book's structure, Lišková's work is divided into 5 chapters. Chapter 1 provides an account of gender and sexual politics in Eastern Europe before and during the communist period. In Chapter 2, Lišková looks at the 1950s, focusing on sexologist campaign for gender equality. Chapter 3 examines a particular facet of this sexological research, studies of women's sexuality and the female orgasm. In Chapter 4, Lišková turns to the years after the failed Prague Spring Uprising of 1968, looking at the equality politics of the immediate post-war period and how they disappeared, to be replaced by sexological attempts to reinscribe traditional family values and norms. And finally, in Chapter 5, Lišková looks at changing approaches to sexual deviance. Okay, I hope all of this gives you some useful things to think about as you read through this groundbreaking piece of historical scholarship. Thanks for watching this video. If you have any questions, please do let me know. And let's get the discussion on sexual liberation, socialist style, going. I look forward to hearing your thoughts and your ideas about this text, and also to reading your response papers on it. Bye-bye for now. Enjoy.